I'm interested in knowing the effects of climate change and global warming on the Shenandoah National Park.
We're just starting to sort that out, and we're concerned about the extremes that are predicted with climate change. So a combination of the extremes in temperature ranges and then also precipitation events. So with the temperature ranges, we have a lot of species at high elevations in the park that are rare, that are more connected to places like Canada or northern Vermont, those kind of places. They're globally rare in some cases, and they're disjunct. This mountain range just doesn't continue that way at that elevation, and so we have these kind of pockets at high elevation. And so we're concerned about those rare species because there's nowhere to go. When things warm up, there's no more up to move.
Right.
So that's a big concern. And so our poster child for that cause is the Shenandoah salamander. It's a species that lives on only 3 mountaintops in the park. And that species we want to know more about. It's hard to find out more about it. It's a terrestrial species. So it's not in the streams, it's in these talus slopes. Lives underground a lot of time, especially in the summertime, so it's pretty reclusive. It's hard to determine what it really needs and what the threats are from climate. Right. But everything, all the models, all the data, all the science for a number of years now point to the fact that it's at least a 30% chance of extinction because, from what we can tell, the major reason would be climate change, changes in temperature and precipitation or moisture that animal requires. So that's a species of concern for us that kind of kicked off our efforts around climate change.
My main question is, can you talk to me about the effects of global warming and climate change on the environment in the Shenandoah National Park?
Yeah, we are expecting with climate change to have several things that may happen here. An increased amount of storms coming through, possibly an increased amount of drought in between the heavy storms. We also think that we might have increased wildfire possibilities. And with the changing climate and temperatures warming, we are worried about what that impact is going to be on our wildlife here in the park.
Sure.
Not just animals, but plants as well.
Sure.
And we do have one species that lives only here in Shenandoah National Park, and it's living at the tops of our highest mountains in the park. It's called the Shenandoah salamander. And here's a picture of the salamander.
Okay.
And it's endemic to the park. It's found nowhere else on Earth. And so we are concerned about what the climate change is going to do to the Shenandoah salamander.
Okay. Okay, now tell me about this.
Well, some people will say, why do we care about a small little salamander that lives under the rocks that we don't see very often?
Right.
Well, because he's part of the ecosystem, and he's just one part of the food chain. There's animals that depend on him for survival, and he depends on other animals, insects, for survival.
Absolutely.
So if we lose one part of the food chain, it affects all the other parts of the food chain.
Right.
And when you look at this little guy, why wouldn't you love him and want to protect them? And part of
there are some other species and other issues, like the hemlocks.
Mm-hmm.
So vegetation. Talk to me about that a little bit.
Sure. There's a lot of other issues that I kind of characterize as emerging threats, things that 10, 15, 20 years ago, similar to climate change, where people just didn't have much of a handle on it. There wasn't many red flags out there. But these emerging threats are coming at a pretty rapid pace here. I don't know if it's just because of our proximity to a bunch of developed areas, where we're at, in the right latitude, whatever it may be. But things like these non-native bugs, these non-native insects like hemlock woolly adelgid, not native to the area, hits on a native host and causes devastating effects. Wow. So right now, best of our knowledge, we have 95% of the hemlocks in the park that we had in the 1990s are gone. We've got about 5% left, and that's a result of treatment. So what we're doing is root injection around individual trees, one tree at a time, trying to maintain that tree against the pest until we can figure out something more systematic, like a biocontrol, or until the science is there. We're trying to hang on to that remaining 5%, which is kind of sad. You got 5% left, but
Right.
that's our hope, to hang on to that genetic pool, to hang on to that remnant population of hemlocks that we have.
Right.
Maybe some resistance will develop, whatever it may be. We're just trying to hang on for the future.
Okay.
But there's a series of those things that are going on from, you could date it back to the chestnut blight.
I was gonna mention the chestnut.
So it's just a huge kind of perturbation that's going on in these forests, just constant change because of something non-native. So the hemlock, the chestnut, just really changing the species composition in these forests. We've got an emerald ash borer that was just documented in the park last year, and that's spreading within the park. That will kill all the ash trees if we leave them untreated right now.
Right.
No known solution to that right now. We've got other forest pests like gypsy moth that ended up with a bit of a natural response there, where there's a certain fungus that under the right environmental conditions, the fungus takes over and kills off the gypsy moths. So they're kind of maintaining in check right now, but for a while they were having pretty devastating effects in the 90s.
Okay.
We've got feral hogs not too far from the park. And I know places like the Great Smoky Mountains National Park have spent a lot of money, a lot of efforts trying to get rid of those animals out of that park because of their devastating effects.
Right.
We've got them like one county over on the Piedmont side of the park. So it just seems like there's one after the other. Just in the last couple of years, the feral hogs, the emerald ash borer, there's another one that I can't even think of right now, that are all kind of these invasive critters, in addition to all the invasive plants that we have in the area that are doing probably better because of climate change. So we've got kudzu on different edges of the park. We've got plants like the mile a minute. You can think of that name and figure out why it was called what it was called. So we have a lot of those that we're spending time on trying to keep away from those sensitive high elevation communities. We can't do it park-wide because there's just too much of it and too many species. Last count, I think we had nearly 360 non-native vascular species, plants, in the park. So we can't chase all of that. But we have to focus on the most invasive, the most challenging, and then do it kind of surgically. Where do we spend our time? Where do we spend our resources? Right next to those rare things that are now at risk from climate change. So it's a constant reactive struggle. And it makes a challenge from my perspective, being in the Park Service for a long time, on what our mission is about. Trying to keep these things going for long term, for future generations. It's a triage decision-making process that's pretty rapid right now compared to what I'm used to in the Park Service, where we had some time to think, we had a threat or a couple threats out there that we could strategize, we could work toward. But this is just like a barrage from my perspective. That really is a challenge to figure out, well, what do we do now, and how do we, as a government agency, a bureaucracy, how do we rapidly respond to these things? It's a challenge.
Sure. Is fire becoming more of a threat? It's not hasn't been historically a big threat here like it is out west.
Right.
But is it potentially becoming more of a threat?
I think so. The other piece is the extremes in precipitation. So climate, the precipitation events here, as we're recording them, seem to be getting more extreme. So it's not necessarily what's going to happen in the future, but what we've been measuring in the last 10, 15 years. It seems like we're often matching or exceeding records, like the droughtiest fall on record matched with the previous spring would be the wettest spring on record, or the second most. So we have all these superlatives with regard to precipitation. It's very dry, it's very wet, it's very dry, it's very wet, and it seems to be matching or coming close to those levels.
Right. So we keep seeing just about every year or two the hottest year on record.
Right.
More storms.
Exactly. So from the we have the issues with the temperature as one piece, and then the issues with this precip business. So far, our concerns are with the aquatic critters, and they're all cold water species in the park, like brook trout and the aquatic communities around that species. And they have temperature thresholds that we're concerned about because we know we've been monitoring stream water temperature for a number of years, and it's going up consistently across the park. The water is warming up. It's not one-to-one with the air temperature, but it is on the rising trend. So we're concerned about that. And then the other confounding thing is those events. So if you're first young of the year brook trout and you're out in the springtime and you have these flood events that are occurring that are pretty extreme, again, some superlative, second or third worst on record, something like that, followed by a drought in the fall. Those types of extremes really can have